She only had one delivery left before her shift ended. A large pepperoni pizza to the penthouse everyone in the city talked about, but no one ever entered. She expected silence, maybe arrogance. Instead, she found a barefoot billionaire hiding from his own life. Neither of them knew that one knock on that door would quietly rewrite everything they thought they wanted. What happened next, no one saw coming. Guys, before I continue, I need to ask for your help. This channel doesn't generate any revenue for me anymore. I don't make any money from these videos, but I have an incredible team that works every week to bring you quality content, and I want to keep that going. That's why I created Allure TV, an app with narrated stories, uncensored, unedited, and ad-free. Things that this platform would never allow here. There's new content every day of the week, and you can listen to it in multiple languages or read it if you prefer. The link is pinned in the comments, or just point your camera at the QR code that's on the screen right now. Help us keep the channel active. I'm truly grateful. Help us keep the channel active. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime, and Tessa Reyes stepped into a world that didn't belong to her. Marble floors stretched beneath her sneakers, cool and flawless, reflecting the golden wash of recessed lighting overhead. She adjusted the pizza box balanced against her hip, feeling suddenly absurdly underdressed in her wrinkled polo shirt and the faint smell of garlic bread clinging to her hair. Penthouse 4001. The top floor of the Ashford Tower, where the air itself seemed to cost more than her monthly rent. She'd been delivering pizzas for 3 years. She'd seen mansions, seen doormen who looked at her like she was invisible, seen tips that ranged from generous to insulting. But she'd never been sent here. To the residence of Andrew Cole, the tech billionaire whose face occasionally flickered across magazine covers with the expression so guarded it bordered on hostile. She half expected her assistant to answer the door, maybe a security guard, someone paid to keep people like her at a professional, forgettable distance. Instead, the door opened, and there he was. No tie, no perfectly pressed blazer, just a rumpled white t-shirt, dark hair falling loose across his forehead, like he'd spent the last hour running his hands through it, and bare feet against the marble, actually bare, toes and all, which felt so wildly incongruous with the $10,000 watch still fastened to his wrist, that Tessa nearly laughed out loud. "You're not what I expected," he said, before she could even open her mouth. "Neither are you," she shot back, and then immediately regretted it, because that was not customer service protocol. That was not the polite half-smile she usually offered before rattling off the total. But something about the way he was looking at her, startled, almost delighted, made the words feel right instead of reckless. He blinked. Then, unmistakably, he smiled. Not the tight, practiced smile from his corporate photos. Something looser, realer. "Fair enough," he said. "Come in before the pizza gets cold and we both regret this." She hesitated at the threshold, the box warm against her palm, steam curling faintly from the cardboard seams and carrying the scent of melted mozzarella and fresh basil into the pristine hallway. It felt wrong somehow to bring that smell, a greasy, familiar human, into a space so aggressively perfect. But he stepped back, holding the door, waiting with an expression that suggested he genuinely wanted her to stay for more than the 90 seconds a delivery required. The penthouse unfolded before her like something out of a design magazine. Floor-to-ceiling windows framing the entire skyline, the city glittering gold and white against a darkening violet sky, furniture so sparse and deliberate it looked untouched. A kitchen gleamed in the corner, pristine steel, marble countertops, without a single crumb or stain in sight. "This kitchen," Tessa said, setting the box down on the island because he gestured for her to, "looks like it's never actually cooked anything. It's like a museum exhibit. Do not touch the stove." Andrew let out a laugh, sudden, surprised, like it had escaped before he could stop it. It transformed his whole face, softened the tight line of his jaw, and for a moment he looked 10 years younger, nothing like the exhausted executive the press loved to photograph mid-scowl. "That's accurate," he admitted, running a hand through his hair again. "I think the stove's been used twice, both times by a chef I hired." "A tragedy," she said solemnly, and he laughed again, quieter this time, like he was still getting used to the sound of it. They stood there a moment too long, the pizza box between them, steam still rising faintly into the cool air. Tessa was acutely aware of the silence that followed. Not awkward exactly, but charged. The kind of silence that asked a question neither of them said out loud. She noticed the faint scent of his cologne, something warm and cedar-toned, cutting through the sterile air of the penthouse. She noticed the way his eyes tracked her face like he was trying to memorize something. "I should go," she said finally, though her feet didn't move. "That's $42.80, by the way, for the pizza." "Right." He reached for his wallet on the counter, fingers fumbling slightly, an unexpected clumsiness from a man who probably closed billion-dollar deals without blinking. When he handed her the cash, his fingers brushed hers for half a second, warm and startling, and neither of them pulled away as fast as they should have. "Keep the change," he said, voice lower now, almost rough. "That's a $200 tip," Tessa said, staring at the bill in her hand like it might bite her. "Consider it payment for the best conversation I've had in months." He wasn't smiling now, not exactly. There was something more vulnerable in his expression, something that looked almost like loneliness peeking through the practiced calm. "Actually, stay. Have a slice with me. It's your pizza, technically. Seems criminal to eat it alone." Tessa's mouth opened to say no, that she had other deliveries, that this wasn't remotely appropriate, that billionaires didn't invite pizza girls to dinner in their penthouses for no reason. But the words that came out instead were entirely different. "One slice," she said, "and only because I'm dying to know if that stove actually works." He grinned, the real one again, and reached for 2 plates from a cabinet that looked like it had never been opened before tonight. Neither of them noticed the time slipping by. Neither of them wanted to. The pizza sat between them on the marble island, cooling slowly, forgotten in favor of conversation that neither of them seemed willing to interrupt. Andrew had traded the 2 porcelain plates for something simpler, paper towels folded in half because, as he admitted with a sheepish shrug, he genuinely didn't know where the casual dishes were kept in a kitchen he barely used. Tessa found that unbearably funny and told him so, and he didn't seem offended. If anything, he looked relieved that someone was finally laughing with him, instead of at the version of him the tabloids had constructed. "So, what's the real story?" Tessa asked, perched on one of the impossibly tall bar stools, "with the whole broody billionaire in magazines thing, because you don't seem broody. You seem like a guy who forgot how his own stove works." Andrew huffed out a laugh, leaning against the counter across from her, arms crossed loosely over his chest. The white t-shirt had ridden up slightly at his side, and Tessa made a very deliberate effort not to notice the sliver of skin above his waistband, or the way his forearms flexed when he reached for his water glass. She noticed anyway. She hated that she noticed. "The broody thing is easier," he said. "People expect it. If I smile in a photo, some analyst writes a think piece about how the company must be doing great. Buy the stock. If I look tired, everyone assumes we're collapsing. So I stopped smiling in public. Turns out that just made things worse. Now everyone thinks I'm some kind of joyless robot who's never eaten a slice of pizza in his life." "You're not wrong about the pizza part," Tessa said, gesturing at the box. "This might genuinely be a historic event for you. Don't remind me." He picked up a slice, folding it the way she had shown him. A small, unnecessary lesson that had somehow taken 5 minutes and 2 arguments about proper pizza-eating technique. He took a bite, closed his eyes for a second like he was actually tasting it, and Tessa felt something warm and unfamiliar twist in her chest at the sight. "Okay," he admitted around the bite. "This is genuinely incredible. What's the place called?" "Marchetti's. Little hole in the wall on 9th. You'd probably never find it. No valet parking, no white tablecloths, just really good sauce and an owner named Gio who yells at everyone equally, rich or poor." "Sounds better than every restaurant I've been dragged to this year," Andrew said, and something in his voice had shifted, quieter, more honest. "Do you know what it's like being invited to a dinner where everyone already knows exactly what you're going to say before you say it, where every laugh is calculated to make you feel important, and every question is really just fishing for information they can use later?" Tessa studied him for a moment, the way his jaw tightened slightly, the way his eyes drifted toward the window, toward the skyline that belonged to him in some abstract financial sense, and yet seemed to hold him at arm's length, like even the city wasn't sure what to make of him. "That sounds lonely," she said quietly. He looked back at her, surprised, like the word had landed somewhere unexpected. "It is," he admitted. "I don't think anyone said that to my face before. Usually people say must be nice or ask me what car I drive. I don't care what car you drive." Tessa shrugged, tearing a piece of crust off her slice. "I care that you apparently haven't used your stove in 6 months, and that you looked personally offended when I said your kitchen looks like a museum." That earned another laugh, freer this time, less guarded, like each one was chipping away at some careful wall he'd built a long time ago. "You're kind of relentless," he said. "I deliver pizza to college frat parties for a living. I've developed a thick skin." "I like it," he said simply, and the words hung there in the space between them a beat too long. Tessa felt her pulse stutter, felt heat rise up the back of her neck that had nothing to do with the warm kitchen air. She glanced away first, toward the window, toward the city lights blinking gold against the darkening sky, giving herself a second to breathe before she did something reckless, like admit she liked him too. Liked this, liked the ease of it, the surprising humanness hiding beneath all that wealth. "What's it like?" Andrew asked after a moment, his voice softer now, genuinely curious. "Your life, I mean. The real version, not the delivery app version." Tessa considered the question, considered how easy it would be to give him the polished answer, the one she gave customers who asked out of politeness. Instead, she told him the truth, about juggling 2 jobs, about the community college classes she took at night, about a mother who worked double shifts at a diner, and a father who'd left when Tessa was 12. She told him about scraping together rent every month, about the constant low hum of financial anxiety that never fully quieted, no matter how many extra shifts she picked up. Andrew listened, really listened, his eyes steady on her face, not once checking his phone or glancing at the door. "That sounds exhausting," he said finally, "and also like you're one of the strongest people I've ever met." Tessa laughed it off, uncomfortable with the weight of the compliment, but she couldn't quite meet his eyes when she did. The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was full, charged, humming faintly with everything neither of them was ready to say. Outside, the city lights blinked on one by one, and inside that pristine penthouse kitchen, 2 people from entirely different worlds sat a little closer than they had an hour ago, neither one in any hurry to leave. "I should really go," Tessa said again, though this time her voice carried even less conviction than before. Andrew didn't argue. He just looked at her, a long, unhurried look that said far more than words could, and asked, "Same time tomorrow?" By the 2nd week, Tessa had noticed the pattern, and she was fairly certain Andrew knew that she'd noticed, which somehow made the whole thing more delicious rather than less. Every single order from the Ashford Tower penthouse came in during her shift. Not before, not after. Always exactly when her name popped up on the delivery app's rotation, like clockwork, like something engineered rather than accidental. "Another large pepperoni for penthouse 4001, Gio called from behind the counter, not even looking up from the dough he was stretching. "3rd time this week. Your billionaire's gonna need a cardiologist before he needs a girlfriend." "He's not my billionaire," Tessa said too quickly, grabbing the insulated bag with a warmth in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the oven's heat. Gio raised an eyebrow, saying nothing, which somehow felt louder than if he'd said everything. The elevator ride up felt different now. Not nervous exactly, but anticipatory, a low hum of electricity settling into her stomach, the way it always did right before those doors slid open. She'd stopped bothering to check her reflection in the brushed steel panel. She told herself that. She was lying, and she knew it, and she did it anyway. Andrew opened the door before she even knocked, which meant he'd been waiting, watching the elevator numbers climb, and the small, satisfied smirk on his face when he saw her told her he knew exactly how transparent that made him. "You're doing this on purpose," Tessa said, stepping past him into the penthouse, close enough that she caught the warm cedar scent of his cologne again, closer this time, sharper. "Doing what?" he asked, all false innocence, closing the door behind her. "Ordering pizza during my shift every single time. I like pizza. You like pizza from me, there's a difference." She set the box down on the counter, same island, same spot, like a routine already forming without either of them agreeing to it out loud. Gio thinks you're going to have a heart attack from all this cheese. Tell Gio I appreciate his concern for my cardiovascular health. Andrew leaned against the counter, arms crossed, watching her with an expression that made her skin feel too warm, despite the penthouse's aggressive air conditioning. Also, tell him the sauce is incredible. Might be the secret ingredient in why I keep ordering. Sure it is, Tessa said dryly, though her pulse was doing something complicated and fast beneath her ribs. He reached past her for plates. He'd found the casual cabinet since last time, apparently. A small victory he'd mentioned with genuine pride. And his arm brushed hers, warm skin against warm skin, brief and accidental, and absolutely not accidental at all. Neither of them moved away immediately. Tessa felt the graze of it travel straight up her arm, settling somewhere in her chest, and when she glanced up, Andrew was already looking at her, something unreadable and heavy in his dark eyes. "Sorry," he said, not sounding sorry in the slightest. "You're really not," Tessa said, breath a little uneven. "No," he admitted, "I'm really not." The air between them thickened, charged with something neither of them named. Tessa busied herself with opening the pizza box, needing something to do with her hands, needing a reason not to keep staring at the small, knowing curve of his mouth. He didn't help, just watched her, quiet, patient, like he had nowhere else in the world to be and nothing else he wanted to do besides exist in this exact moment with her. "You know, people are starting to talk," Tessa said, changing the subject before she did something reckless, like lean into that magnetic quiet between them. "Gio thinks I've got a secret rich boyfriend. My roommate keeps asking why I smell like cologne when I get home." Andrew's eyebrows lifted, something pleased flickering behind his eyes. "You smell like my cologne? That's not the point." "It's a little bit the point." He was smiling now, that real, unguarded smile that had become dangerously familiar to her over the past 2 weeks, the one that made him look less like a magazine cover and more like an actual person, one she was beginning to know far too well for someone who was, technically, just delivering his dinner. "My assistants noticed the pattern too," he admitted, sobering slightly, running a hand through his hair in that gesture she now recognized as nerves rather than carelessness. "She asked why I suddenly developed such specific taste in delivery timing." "What did you tell her?" "That the pizza's better at that hour." He shrugged, but his eyes didn't quite meet hers now, something more vulnerable creeping into his voice. "She didn't believe me either." Tessa laughed, soft and a little breathless, and reached for a slice, deliberately not looking at him, deliberately trying to slow the accelerated rhythm of her own heartbeat. "This is a bad idea," she said, more to herself than to him. "Probably," Andrew agreed, watching her with an intensity that made the word feel like an invitation rather than a warning. "Does that change anything?" She should have said yes. She should have packed up her insulated bag and taken the elevator back down to the lobby, and told Gio to reassign the Ashford Tower deliveries to someone else entirely, someone whose pulse didn't stutter every time this man looked at her like she was the only interesting thing in his very large, very empty penthouse. Instead, she met his eyes and said, "No, it really doesn't." The silence that followed wasn't comfortable exactly. It was heavier than that, thick with everything neither of them was brave enough to say aloud yet. Andrew's gaze dropped briefly to her mouth, then back up, and Tessa felt her breath catch somewhere in her throat, felt the whole kitchen tilt slightly on its axis. Her phone buzzed. Another delivery notification. Another shift demanding her attention, another world pulling her back down from whatever strange electric altitude she'd climbed to in this penthouse. She stepped back first, putting necessary distance between them before she did something she couldn't take back. "I have to go," she said, voice rougher than she intended. Andrew nodded slowly, though his eyes stayed on her, unreadable and warm all at once. "Same time tomorrow?" Tessa didn't answer immediately. She just smiled and, small, helpless, entirely too fond, and let the elevator doors close on the question, knowing exactly what her answer would be. Rain had been falling since early afternoon, turning the city into a blur of neon reflections and hissing tires, and by the time Tessa's shift ended, she was soaked through her uniform jacket, hair plastered to her forehead, sneakers squelching with every step toward the bus stop. She'd resigned herself to a miserable 40-minute ride home when a familiar sleek silhouette pulled up to the curb. Dark, low, engine humming, with the kind of quiet expense that made pedestrians instinctively step back. The window rolled down. Andrew leaned across the passenger seat, dark hair damp from apparently running out to intercept her, an expression of stubborn concern on his face. "Get in. You're going to catch pneumonia standing there." "I don't need saving," Tessa said, though her teeth were audibly chattering, undercutting the defiance in her voice. "I know. Get in anyway." She got in. The car's interior smelled like leather and rain and faintly like him, that same warm cedar note that had become embarrassingly familiar to her senses. Heat poured from the vents, and Tessa held her hands up to it gratefully, watching rivulets of water trace down the windshield as Andrew pulled smoothly into traffic, city lights streaking gold and red across the wet glass. "You didn't have to do this," she said quietly after a moment. "I wanted to." His eyes stayed on the road, jaw tight with something that wasn't quite tension, but wasn't quite ease either. "I've been driving past your bus stop for the last 20 minutes, actually. Told myself I was just heading home." Tessa turned to look at him, something in her chest loosening at the admission. "That's a little unhinged." "Yeah," he agreed, a small, rueful smile tugging at his mouth. "I'm aware." The rain intensified, drumming against the roof, wipers sweeping in a steady, hypnotic rhythm, and for a while neither of them spoke, the silence stretching comfortable and warm between them, despite the storm outside. Tessa watched the city slide past the window, familiar streets rendered strange and beautiful through sheets of rain, and became gradually aware of how close they were sitting, how the small space of the car made every breath feel shared, intimate, charged with an intensity that had nothing to do with the weather. "Can I ask you something?" Andrew said eventually, voice quieter now, stripped of its usual polish. "Depends on the something. Do you ever worry that people only want things from you, that nobody actually sees you, just what you can give them?" Tessa considered the question, considered the strange vulnerability threading through his voice, so unlike the composed executive from the magazine covers. "Every day," she admitted. "I worry people see the tips or the sob story, or whatever version of poor hard-working girl makes them feel better about their own lives." "Why?" Andrew's hands tightened slightly on the wheel, knuckles pale. "Because I've spent 10 years wondering if anyone in my life actually wants me, or just wants what I can buy them. My last relationship ended because she admitted calmly over dinner that she'd stay even if she didn't love me because my money made everything easier. She said it like it was a compliment." "That's horrible," Tessa said softly. "It's honest, at least." He exhaled, long and slow. "But it's lonely. You spend so long waiting for someone to want you specifically, and not the account balance attached to your name, that you start to forget what that even feels like." Tessa studied his profile in the passing streetlight, the tight line of his jaw, the shadows beneath his eyes that no amount of money could apparently buy away. "I get scared of the opposite," she said quietly. "That I'll always be defined by what I don't have, that people will look at me and see struggling before they see anything else, that I'll spend my whole life apologizing for a life I didn't choose." "You shouldn't apologize for that," Andrew said, glancing at her now, something fierce and sincere in his expression. "You're the strongest, most genuine person I've met in years, and it has nothing to do with your bank account." The car had slowed, pulling toward the curb outside her building, engine idling low in the rain-soaked quiet. Neither of them moved to end the moment. The windows had begun to fog slightly, blurring the outside world into soft, indistinct shapes, leaving just the two of them in a small, warm bubble of confession and rain sound. "Why do I feel like I can tell you things I've never told anyone?" Andrew asked, voice barely above a whisper now. "I don't know," Tessa said, equally quiet, her heart hammering unevenly against her ribs. "Maybe because neither of us is pretending anymore." His eyes dropped to her mouth, then rose back to meet hers, and the air in the car seemed to still entirely, rain drumming softly overhead, the whole world reduced to the small distance between them. His hand lifted, hesitant, and brushed a damp strand of hair back from her face, fingers lingering a fraction of a second too long against her cheek. "Tessa," he murmured, her name sounding entirely different in his voice than she'd ever heard it before. Reverent, uncertain, wanting. She should have pulled away. She should have thanked him for the ride and hurried inside before either of them did something neither could take back. Instead, she found herself leaning almost imperceptibly closer, breath shallow, pulse thundering in her ears, caught entirely in the gravity of his gaze. A car horn blared somewhere down the street, sharp and sudden, shattering the moment before it could fully form. Tessa blinked, pulling back, cheeks flushed, heart still racing. Andrew's hand dropped away slowly, reluctantly, an unspoken apology and an unspoken promise both flickering across his face. "I should go in," Tessa said, voice unsteady. "Yeah," Andrew agreed, though he made no move to unlock the doors, watching her instead, with an expression that made her chest ache. "Tessa?" "Good night, Andrew," she said softly, cutting him off before either of them said something that would change everything, and slipped out into the rain, leaving him staring after her, engine idling, heart clearly still racing behind the fogged glass. Marchetti's was loud on Friday nights. The clatter of plates, Gio shouting orders in rapid-fire Italian-accented English, the hiss of the pizza oven, the low hum of a dozen conversations blending into comfortable chaos. Tessa had worked the dinner shift 100 times before, weaving between tables with practiced ease, and she didn't notice the ripple of hushed murmurs near the front door until she glanced up and nearly dropped the tray in her hands. Andrew Cole was standing in the doorway of Marchetti's, wearing a simple charcoal sweater and dark jeans, looking entirely, deliberately out of place among the mismatched chairs and red-checkered tablecloths, and entirely unbothered by it. "What are you doing here?" Tessa hissed, setting the tray down at the nearest empty table before hurrying over, aware of at least 6 pairs of eyes tracking her across the restaurant, including Gio's, whose eyebrows had climbed somewhere near his hairline. "I wanted to see where the incredible pizza actually comes from," Andrew said, hands tucked into his pockets, looking around at the worn booths and hand-painted mural of the Amalfi Coast with something like genuine delight rather than the polite disdain she half expected. "This place has character. This place has a leaky ceiling and a walk-in freezer that only works if you kick it in the right spot. Even better, a woman 2 tables over had her phone out, not so subtly angling it in Andrew's direction, and Tessa felt her stomach twist. "People are staring," she murmured. "Let them." His eyes stayed steady on her face, unbothered, warm. "Can I sit? Or is this against restaurant policy, Billionaire's loitering near the hostess stand?" Despite herself, Tessa laughed, the tension in her shoulders easing slightly. "Booth in the back. Try not to attract a crowd." He didn't manage that, not entirely. A few more phones came out over the next hour. A couple of texts were clearly sent to friends with breathless, "You won't believe who's at Marchetti's" energy. But Andrew seemed genuinely indifferent to it, focused instead on the menu, on Gio's booming recommendations shouted from the kitchen, on Tessa herself every time she passed his table with a refill or a new order for someone else. Near the end of her shift, during a rare lull, Tessa finally sat down across from him exhausted, feet aching, hair coming loose from its ponytail. "You really didn't have to do this," she said, reaching for the water glass he'd left for her. "I know." He watched her drink, something soft in his expression. "I wanted to see your world, the real one, not the version that shows up at my door in a delivery uniform for 90 seconds. "And? Verdict?" "I like it," he said simply. "I like Gio. I like the mural. I like watching you laugh with regulars like you've known them your whole life." He paused, something more serious entering his voice. "I like that nobody here treats you like you're invisible." Tessa's chest tightened at that, at the quiet observation buried in his words, that he'd really noticed the thing she'd feared her whole adult life, being overlooked, being reduced to a uniform and a delivery time slot. "Nobody treats you like you're invisible either," she said softly. "Kind of the opposite problem, actually." "Touché." A faint, self-deprecating smile crossed his face. Gio approached with a fresh basket of garlic knots, setting them down with a loud thud and an appraising look at Andrew that lasted several seconds too long. "You," Gio said, pointing a flour-dusted finger, Better be good to her. She works too hard for someone to waste her time. Gio, Tessa groaned, mortified, burying her face briefly in her hands. I intend to, Andrew said, entirely serious, meeting Gio's eyes without flinching, and something about the solemn weight of his tone made Tessa's pulse stutter. Gio grunted, apparently satisfied, and disappeared back into the kitchen, muttering something in Italian that Tessa was fairly certain was a threat. When her shift finally ended, Andrew walked her to the small back office to grab her things, waiting near the doorway while she gathered her jacket and bag. She turned, nearly bumping into him in the narrow hallway, and he reached out instinctively to steady her, hands landing lightly on her waist, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating off him, close enough that the space between them seemed to shrink to almost nothing. Sorry, he murmured, though he didn't step back. You keep saying that, Tessa said, breathless, and you keep not meaning it. Guilty, he admitted, voice low, eyes dropping briefly to her mouth before returning to her eyes, dark and unguarded, and full of something neither of them had said out loud yet. Her hand found the napkin dispenser on the nearby shelf, needing something to hold on to, and his fingers brushed hers as he reached for the same thing at the exact same moment. A small electric collision that neither of them pulled away from immediately. The moment stretched, charged and quiet, the noise of the restaurant fading into some distant hum beyond the walls of the narrow hallway. Tessa, Andrew said softly, and something about the way he said her name, reverent, careful, like it mattered more than anything else he could say, made her breath catch entirely. Yeah, she managed. I don't want to just be the guy who shows up for pizza anymore. The words hung there, unmistakable, impossible to misread. Tessa's heart pounded so loudly she was certain he could hear it in the quiet hallway. She opened her mouth to respond, to say something equally honest, equally frightening, when Gio's voice boomed from the kitchen, calling her name for a forgotten order slip, shattering the moment before either of them could finish it. Andrew stepped back first this time, jaw tight, eyes still locked on hers. Dinner, he said. A real one, not pizza in my kitchen. Somewhere neither of us has to hide. Tessa swallowed hard, the napkin dispenser forgotten in her hand, her entire body still humming from the almost moment in the hallway. Okay, she whispered. His answering smile was the realest, most unguarded thing she'd ever seen on his face, and it made the ground beneath her feel entirely unsteady in the best possible way. The headline appeared on Tessa's phone at 6:47 in the morning, forwarded by her roommate, with 3 panicked exclamation points and no other explanation necessary. Billionaire Andrew Cole's secret romance with a pizza delivery girl. Who is Tessa Reyes? Tessa sat frozen on the edge of her bed, scrolling through paragraph after paragraph of speculation dressed up as journalism, a grainy photo of herself and Andrew standing too close in the narrow hallway of Marchetti's splashed across the top of the article. Someone had sold that photo. Someone had been watching, waiting, cataloguing a private moment that had felt like it belonged only to the two of them. Her phone buzzed relentlessly, texts from friends, a voicemail from her mother, asking with genuine confusion if this was some kind of joke. A message from her shift manager asking, with visible discomfort, if this was going to be a problem for the restaurant's public image. Tessa's stomach churned as she read comment after comment beneath the article. Strangers dissecting her life, her worth, her motives, as though she were a puzzle to be solved rather than a person. Gold digger, obviously. Give it 3 months, he'll get bored. Must be nice landing a billionaire by delivering his dinner. By the time Andrew called, Tessa had already cried once, quietly, in the shower, furious at herself for letting strangers' words affect her this deeply. I saw it, he said, voice tight the moment she answered. I'm so sorry. I don't know how they got that photo. It doesn't matter how, Tessa cut in, more sharply than she intended. It's out there now. Everyone thinks I'm... She stopped, throat tight, unable to finish the sentence. You're not that, Andrew said fiercely. Whatever they're saying, it's not true, and I'll handle it. Handle it how? Tessa's voice cracked slightly. Andrew, this isn't a business problem you can throw money at. This is my life. My mom called me crying this morning because reporters showed up at the diner where she works. The silence on the other end of the line stretched, heavy and helpless. I didn't think about that, he admitted quietly. "I'm sorry." That evening, against her better judgment, Tessa agreed to meet him, not at the penthouse, not at Marchetti's, but at a quiet private members' club where, apparently, no cameras were allowed past the lobby. The absurdity of needing a fortress just to have a conversation wasn't lost on her. Andrew looked exhausted when she arrived, dark circles under his eyes, tie loosened at his collar like he'd spent the day being pulled in a dozen directions. "My board called an emergency meeting this afternoon," he said without preamble, guiding her to a private corner table. "They're worried about optics. Investors are asking questions about my judgment." "Because of me," Tessa said flatly. "Because of them," Andrew corrected, frustration coloring his voice. "Because some outdated idea of what a CEO's partner should look like has apparently convinced grown adults that my personal life is their business." "What did they say, specifically?" Andrew hesitated, and that hesitation told her everything before he even spoke. "My mother suggested, very politely, that perhaps I should consider someone more aligned with the company's image, someone from a similar background." A few board members echoed the sentiment, dressed up in careful corporate language. Tessa felt something cold settle in her chest, the words landing exactly where she'd feared they would. "So I'm bad for the brand." "That's not what I think," Andrew said quickly, reaching for her hand across the table. "But it's what they think, and you work for them, technically, or with them. Whatever the corporate word is." Tessa pulled her hand back gently, not out of anger exactly, but out of some instinct towards self-protection. "Andrew, I've spent my whole life being underestimated, being told I'm not enough, not smart enough, not polished enough, not from the right place. I can't do this if I'm always going to be the headline nobody quite approves of. You're not just a headline to me." His voice was low, urgent, eyes locked on hers, with an intensity that made her chest ache. "You're the first person in years who's made me feel like an actual human being instead of a portfolio. I'm not going to let some board members and a tabloid article decide who I'm allowed to care about." "That's easy to say in private," Tessa said softly, some of the fight draining out of her voice, replaced by something more tired, more scared. "But when it actually comes down to choosing your company, your family's approval, the life you've built, I don't know if I believe you'd actually choose the pizza girl." The words hung there, brutal and honest, and Andrew flinched like she'd struck him. "Tessa, I need to go," she said quietly. Gathering her jacket, throat tight with unshed tears, she refused to let fall in front of him. "I need to think." He didn't stop her, though the look on his face, gown-stricken, desperate, torn, followed her all the way to the door, a silent plea she wasn't yet ready to answer. Outside, the city hummed on, indifferent to the quiet devastation splitting open in Tessa's chest, and for the first time since that rainy elevator ride to the penthouse, she let herself wonder if some distances simply couldn't be closed, no matter how badly two people wanted to close them. Tessa stopped answering after the third call. It wasn't dramatic, not at first, just a quiet decision made somewhere between her shift ending and the walk home, a small act of self-preservation that felt necessary even as it hollowed something out inside her chest. She let Andrew's calls go to voicemail. She read his texts without responding, watching the little read notification appear and knowing exactly how that silence must have felt on the other end, and hating herself a little for it, and doing it anyway. "I meant what I said," one text read. "I'm not choosing anyone over you. Please call me back. I know you're scared. I am too. But running from this isn't going to make it hurt less. Tessa, please." She read each one 3 times before locking her phone and setting it face down on her nightstand, as if the physical act of not looking at the screen could quiet the ache spreading through her chest. Her roommate found her on the couch on a Tuesday night, wrapped in a blanket she didn't need in the mild spring air, staring blankly at a muted television. "You look like something died," her roommate said gently, settling beside her. "Something did," Tessa admitted quietly. "I think I killed it, actually." Work became her only anchor. Long shifts at Marchetti's, the comforting chaos of the kitchen, Gio's booming voice a strange kind of lullaby amid the noise. But even there, Andrew's absence followed her, conspicuous in the empty booth in the back, in the fact that the Ashford Tower penthouse had stopped ordering pizza entirely, a silence that spoke louder than any headline ever could. "You gonna tell me what happened?" Gio asked one slow evening, sliding a plate of garlic knots toward her with a gruffness that didn't quite mask his concern. "He has a life I can't fit into," Tessa said simply, picking at the bread without much appetite. "A board, a family, an entire world that thinks I'm some kind of PR mistake." "And what do you think?" Gio pressed, wiping down the counter with more force than necessary. Tessa didn't have an answer for that, not one she was ready to say out loud anyway. Across the city, in the sterile quiet of the Ashford Tower boardroom, Andrew was fighting a different kind of battle. The board had assembled an emergency session, not about Tessa directly, not officially, but everyone in the room understood exactly what the carefully worded agenda item, leadership image and stakeholder confidence, actually meant. "We're not asking you to end anything," his mother said carefully, seated at the head of the table, her tone diplomatic in the way that made Andrew's jaw clench. "We're simply suggesting a period of discretion until the merger closes. Investors are risk-averse, Andrew. Perception matters." "Perception," Andrew repeated flatly. "You mean you want me to hide her, pretend she doesn't exist, until it's convenient for the quarterly report?" "I mean, I want you to think about the company your father built," his mother said, quieter now, something almost pleading beneath the corporate polish. "Everything he sacrificed, everything you've sacrificed to get here." Andrew sat in silence for a long moment, staring at the polished table, at the rows of concerned faces waiting for him to fold, to be reasonable, to choose the safe and expected path he'd walked his entire adult life. He thought of Tessa's laugh in his kitchen, of rain streaking down a windshield, of a hallway at Marchetti's where, for one perfect moment, he'd felt more like himself than he had in a decade. "I've spent 10 years building an empire," he said finally, voice steady despite the storm building in his chest. "And somewhere along the way I forgot to build a life. Tessa isn't a liability. She's the first honest thing I've had in years, and I'm not giving that up because it makes a stakeholder deck look complicated." The room fell silent, several board members exchanging uneasy glances, his mother's expression unreadable. But Andrew didn't wait for their approval. He stood, gathered his things, and walked out, not toward another meeting, not toward the safety of his office, but toward his car, toward the one place he actually wanted to be. Except Tessa wasn't answering, and the empty passenger seat beside him felt like an accusation all its own. That night, alone in the penthouse that had once felt full of possibility and now echoed with a silence he couldn't stand, Andrew stared at his phone, thumb hovering over her contact photo. A picture he'd taken without her noticing, mid-laugh, radiant and unguarded. He thought about the rain-soaked hallway, about the words he hadn't finished saying. "I don't want to just be the guy who shows up for pizza anymore." He'd never gotten to say the rest. "I want to be the guy who shows up. Period. For everything. For you." Instead, he set the phone down, chest aching with a hollow, unfamiliar grief, the particular pain of losing something before he'd even had the chance to properly claim it. Outside his window, the city glittered on, indifferent and vast, and for the first time in years, all that wealth, all that carefully built empire, felt like the emptiest thing he owned. Somewhere across that same skyline, in a small apartment above a laundromat, Tessa lay awake too, staring at her ceiling, phone silent on the nightstand, wondering if she'd just made the biggest mistake of her life, or saved herself from one. Neither of them slept well. Neither of them stopped thinking about the other, not for one single hour of that long, aching night. 10 days of silence had passed when Andrew showed up at Marchetti's during the Sunday lunch rush. No assistant trailing behind him, no car idling conspicuously at the curb. Just him, in a plain grey jacket, standing in the doorway with an expression that made the entire restaurant go quiet the moment he stepped inside. Tessa froze mid-step, a tray balanced on her hip, her heart lurching so violently she nearly lost her grip on the plates. Gio, sensing the shift in the air the way he sensed everything in his restaurant, quietly ushered the nearest customers toward other tables, buying them space without a single word exchanged. "You can't just show up here," Tessa said, voice unsteady, setting the tray down on the counter with hands that weren't entirely cooperating. "I know," Andrew said. "I did it anyway. I'm done being careful about the wrong things." "Andrew, please," he said, and something in the raw, unpolished plea in his voice stopped her cold. "Just give me 2 minutes. If you still want me to leave after that, I will. I won't call again. I won't show up again. Just 2 minutes." Tessa glanced around at the restaurant, at Gio pointedly finding something urgent to do in the kitchen, at the curious, not quite subtle glances from nearby tables, and finally nodded toward the back hallway, the same narrow space where, weeks ago, his hand had found her waist and neither of them had wanted to move. 2 minutes, she agreed, arms crossed protectively over her chest. Andrew followed her into the quiet of the hallway, and for a moment he just looked at her, like he was memorizing her face after 10 days of not being allowed to. "I walked out of a board meeting," he said finally, "the day after you stopped answering. They wanted me to distance myself from you until some merger closed, some quarterly optics thing, and I told them no. I told my own mother no." Tessa's breath caught, but she said nothing, waiting, still guarded. "I've spent 10 years being exactly who everyone needed me to be," Andrew continued, voice rough now, stripped of every careful, practiced edge she'd once associated with him. "The reliable heir, the unshakable CEO, the guy who doesn't flinch in negotiations and doesn't need anyone because needing people is a liability in this business. And then you showed up with a pizza and a smart mouth and completely destroyed all of that in about 90 seconds. That's not exactly a compliment," Tessa said, though her voice had softened despite herself. "It's the best thing that's ever happened to me," Andrew said, stepping closer, close enough that she could see the exhaustion etched into the lines around his eyes, the 10 days of sleeplessness that clearly matched her own. "Tessa, I don't care about the merger. I don't care about the headlines or the board or what my mother thinks looks appropriate in a press photo. I would rather lose the entire company than lose you. And I know how insane that sounds coming from a guy who spent his whole life building that company like it was the only thing that mattered." Tessa's eyes stung, her carefully constructed defenses cracking under the weight of his words, under the raw sincerity in his voice that no amount of money could have manufactured. "You can't just say things like that," she whispered. "You can't just show up and say the one thing that undoes everything I've been trying to protect myself from." "Why not?" His hand lifted, hesitant, cupping her cheek with a gentleness that made her breath shudder. "Because it's true. Because I've spent 10 days unable to sleep, unable to focus, unable to sit in that penthouse without seeing you in every corner of it. Because I don't want an empire if it means an empty life. I want this. I want you laughing at my terrible cooking and calling my kitchen a museum and making me feel like an actual person instead of a headline." A tear slipped free before Tessa could stop it, and Andrew's thumb brushed it away with a tenderness that undid the last of her resistance. "I was scared," she admitted, voice breaking. "Scared that the moment things got hard, you'd choose the world you already had over the mess I'd bring into it." "I already chose," Andrew said fiercely, his forehead dropping to rest against hers, both of them breathing unsteadily in the narrow, quiet hallway. "I chose you the second you called my kitchen a museum exhibit. Everything since then has just been me catching up to that fact." Tessa let out a wet, disbelieving laugh, her hands finding the front of his jacket, gripping the fabric like an anchor. "This is insane," she whispered. "Completely," Andrew agreed, his voice thick with emotion, his eyes searching hers with a desperate, hopeful intensity. "Tell me it's not too late. Tell me I didn't just walk in here and make a fool of myself in front of your entire restaurant for nothing." "You didn't," Tessa said softly, tears and relief tangled together in her voice. "It's not too late." The 2 minutes had long since expired, and neither of them noticed nor cared, as the narrow hallway filled with something neither of them had dared to name until this exact trembling moment. Something that felt, finally, unmistakably, like the beginning of everything they'd both been too afraid to want. The Ashford Holdings boardroom had never felt smaller than it did on the morning Andrew walked in with Tessa beside him. It hadn't been an easy decision bringing her here, into the glass-walled fortress of polished mahogany and quiet, calculated power that had shaped his entire adult life. But when Andrew had told her about the follow-up meeting, the one where the board intended to formalize their recommendation regarding his personal life ahead of the merger vote, Tessa had surprised him by asking to come. "If they're going to talk about me," she'd said, chin lifted, "they can do it to my face." Now standing just inside the doorway in a simple navy dress, her hands clasped tightly in front of her to hide their trembling, Tessa felt every pair of eyes in the room land on her at once, assessing, calculating, some openly skeptical. Andrew's mother, Diane Cole, sat at the head of the table, her expression composed into something diplomatically neutral, though her eyes lingered on Tessa a beat too long. "Andrew," Diane said carefully, "this is a private strategic session." "It concerns my personal life," Andrew replied evenly, guiding Tessa to a seat beside his own at the table, not at the far end, not tucked away, but directly at his side, a deliberate, unmistakable statement. So she stays. A ripple of uneasy glances passed around the table. One board member, an older man named Whitfield, who'd served on the board since Andrew's father's era, cleared his throat pointedly. "Andrew, we've discussed this. The merger with Castellane Group is worth $800 million. Their leadership has expressed concerns about stability, about optics. This isn't personal. It's fiduciary." "With respect," Andrew said, voice steady despite the visible tension in his jaw, "you're asking me to treat the person I love like a liability on a balance sheet. That's not a fiduciary concern. That's a values problem, and it's mine to solve, not the board's." The word love landed heavily in the room, and Tessa felt her chest tighten, heat rushing to her face, not from embarrassment, but from the sheer unguarded courage of him saying it here, in this room, in front of the people whose approval he'd spent his entire life chasing. "Andrew," Diane said quietly, "I'm not trying to hurt you. I'm trying to protect what your father built. Then trust me when I say this isn't going to destroy it." Andrew leaned forward, hands flat on the table, meeting every gaze in the room in turn. "I've spent 10 years making decisions based on what looked right on paper, what impressed investors, what made the company appear bulletproof. And in all that time, I don't think I've made a single decision based on what actually made me happy or honest or human. Tessa isn't a threat to this company's stability. She's the reason I remembered I'm allowed to have a life outside of it." Whitfield's expression remained skeptical, but a few other board members exchanged quieter, more thoughtful glances. Tessa, sensing an opening, found her voice, despite the tremor still running through her hands. "I understand this looks strange from where you're sitting," she said, addressing the table directly, her voice gaining steadiness with each word. "I deliver pizza. I don't have a business degree or a family name that means anything to Castellane Group. But I'm not asking any of you to approve of me. I'm just asking you to let Andrew make his own choice about his own life, the way any of you would want for yourselves." Diane studied her for a long moment, something shifting almost imperceptibly behind her composed expression. "You clearly care about him," she said finally, quietly, almost to herself. "I do," Tessa said simply. "More than I expected to, more than I think either of us planned on." The room fell into a heavy, considering silence. Andrew reached over, taking Tessa's hand beneath the table, his thumb brushing reassuring circles against her knuckles, a small, steadying anchor amid the tension. "I'm not asking for the board's blessing," Andrew said finally, breaking the silence, voice firm and unwavering. "I'm informing you of my decision. If Castellane Group wants to walk away from an $800 million merger because their partners can't stomach their CEO being in a genuine relationship, then perhaps they're not the partners this company needs in the first place. I'll take that risk. I won't take the alternative." Whitfield opened his mouth to argue further, but Diane raised a hand, quieting him with a small, resigned shake of her head. "Let the vote stand as originally scheduled," she said. "No further conditions." Her eyes moved to Tessa once more, something almost gentle flickering there now. "For what it's worth, my husband built this company with nothing but conviction and a fair amount of stubbornness. It seems my son inherited both." Andrew let out a breath he'd clearly been holding, some of the tension easing from his shoulders. Beside him, Tessa felt tears prick unexpectedly at her eyes, not from sadness, but from something fiercer, more grateful, the overwhelming relief of watching someone choose her, publicly, without flinching, against every pressure the world could apply. As the meeting adjourned and board members filed out in murmuring clusters, Andrew turned to her, his expression open and unguarded in a way she'd never seen him allow in this building before. "Thank you," he murmured, "for coming in here and being braver than half this boardroom combined." "Thank you for choosing me out loud," Tessa said softly, "in front of everyone who mattered to your old life." "You are my life now," Andrew said, cupping her face gently, ignoring the lingering stragglers still gathering their things nearby. "The company was never going to be enough on its own. I just needed you to show me that." Outside the glass walls of the boardroom, the city stretched on beneath a clear afternoon sky, and for the first time since the headlines had first threatened to tear them apart, Tessa let herself believe, fully, fearlessly, that maybe this fragile, improbable thing between them might actually survive everything the world tried to throw at it. 6 months had passed since the boardroom, since the merger closed anyway. Castellane Group had in the end cared far more about the numbers than about who occupied Andrew's personal life, and since the tabloids had finally, mercifully, moved on to someone else's scandal. Tessa had kept her job at Marchetti's, though these days she split her hours between delivery shifts and finishing her business degree at night, a decision entirely her own, made without a cent of Andrew's money attached to it. Andrew had learned to make a passable carbonara. Progress, Tessa liked to remind him, came in small, ridiculous victories. It was a Tuesday evening in early autumn when Tessa's phone buzzed with a delivery notification. An order from the Ashford Tower, Penthouse 4001, the address that would forever mean something entirely different to her than it once had. She frowned at her screen, standing behind the counter at Marchetti's, tying her apron strings with practiced efficiency. "That's weird," she murmured to Gio, who was elbow-deep in dough nearby. "He usually just texts me if he wants dinner." Gio, who had grown fonder of Andrew than he'd ever admit aloud, merely shrugged with theatrical innocence that didn't fool her for a second. "Maybe he missed the old-fashioned way," he said, sliding a fresh pizza box across the counter toward her, already boxed and ready. "Large pepperoni, same as always." Something in his tone made Tessa narrow her eyes suspiciously, but she grabbed the insulated bag anyway, tucking the box inside with familiar, practiced motions, her heart inexplicably racing as she stepped out into the cool evening air. The elevator ride up to the 40th floor felt different this time. Not nervous exactly, but strangely nostalgic, like retracing the steps of a memory that had changed the entire shape of her life. She remembered vividly the girl who'd stepped off this elevator 6 months ago, soaked in the smell of garlic bread, utterly unprepared for what waited behind that penthouse door. When the doors slid open, Andrew was waiting in the hallway, not the doorway this time, dressed simply in the same charcoal sweater he'd worn the night he'd shown up at Marchetti's uninvited, holding nothing in his hands. No phone, no wallet, ready with cash. "So you ordered pizza and didn't even bring your wallet?" Tessa asked, amused, holding up the insulated bag. "That's a rookie mistake." "I didn't order this to pay for it," Andrew said, and something in his voice, quiet, steady, achingly sincere, made her pause, made her really look at him for the first time since stepping off the elevator. "Then why—" "Because 6 months ago you stepped off this exact elevator and completely rearranged my entire life without meaning to," Andrew said, closing the distance between them slowly, deliberately. "And I wanted to stand in this exact hallway again and tell you that nothing that's happened since, not the merger, not the board, not one single headline, has meant more to me than that first ridiculous conversation about my kitchen looking like a museum." Tessa's breath caught, the pizza box suddenly forgotten, hanging loosely from her fingers. "Andrew." He reached into his back pocket. Not for a wallet, she realized with a jolt, but for something small, which he held now between careful fingers, catching the hallway light. "I've closed billion-dollar deals without blinking," he said, voice unsteady in a way she'd never heard before, achingly vulnerable. "And somehow, this feels like the only negotiation that's ever actually terrified me." Her hands trembled as she set the pizza box down on the narrow hallway table, tears already blurring her vision, before he'd even finished lowering himself in front of her. "Tessa Reyes," Andrew said, voice thick with emotion. "You walked into my life with a pizza and a smart mouth, And you taught me more about being human in 6 months than a decade of building an empire ever did. I don't want a life that looks impressive on paper anymore. I want a life that feels like this, like laughing in a kitchen, like rain on a windshield, like a hallway at Marchetti's, where I finally learned how to say what I actually meant. Marry me, not because it makes sense or because it looks good in a headline, but because I genuinely cannot imagine a version of my future that doesn't have you standing exactly where you are right now. The insulated bag slipped entirely from Tessa's fingers, forgotten. As she pressed both hands to her mouth, tears spilling freely now, her whole body trembling with an overwhelming, joyful disbelief. "Yes," she managed, laughing and crying all at once. "Yes, obviously, yes." Andrew rose, slipping the ring onto her trembling hand, with a reverence that made her heart ache before pulling her into an embrace so full of relief and joy that neither of them noticed the pizza box tipping precariously on the table beside them. "For the record," Tessa whispered against his chest, laughing through her tears, "this is a very expensive way to deliver a pizza." "Worth every cent," Andrew murmured into her hair, holding her like he never intended to let go again. Downstairs, unbeknownst to either of them, Gia was already texting the entire Marchetti's staff group chat, 3 exclamation points and a string of celebratory emojis lighting up phones across the city. The beginning of a story that had started with one absurd, unplanned delivery and was ending 6 months later, exactly where it always should have. In a penthouse hallway, wrapped in laughter, tears, and a love neither of them had been brave enough to expect. But both of them, in the end, had been brave enough to choose. She once feared being invisible. He once feared being loved for the wrong reasons. Together they proved that true connection doesn't ask for permission. It simply arrives, uninvited, like a pizza on a rainy night. What would you risk if love knocked on your door tonight? Go ahead and drop your like, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a story. And if you want more, to live it all without ads, without interruptions, with an intensity I just can't show here, check out my app. The link's in the pinned comment. New stories drop there every single day, deeper romances, more intense, and some a lot bolder. It's a whole different level in there. Go check it out now. Go check.